By now your CV should include all of the appropriate content. So now we will talk about tips for finishing your CV so it is as appealing to your audience and very professional. Let's take a moment to talk about formatting. As we discussed in previous lectures, one of the big differences between a CV and a resume is formatting. Resumes can often be a little flashier and a little more interesting than a CV, and a CV is typically traditional, maybe even considered a little boring by some people. Some of the class members have put together very beautiful CV formats. They are modern, visually appealing, and just nice to look at. However, in many settings, this type of CV formatting may be too flashy and modern for your audience. If you have put together a fancy, visually appealing CV, keep it. But the current climate in medicine doesn't quite seem ready for that in most cases. So for the purpose of this class and most of the jobs you'll apply for right now, pull out the boring and traditional CV. There are some employers who will throw out a CV that is too hit because, unfortunately, they just aren't ready for that format yet. That means black and white, standard font, simplicity, probably a few columns, if at all, and no graphics. In his article, The Science Behind Fonts and How They Make You Feel, Michael Cho says, "I've noticed how seemingly small things like font and the spacing between letters can impact how I feel when reading online. The right font choice, along with the absence of sidebars and pop-ups, makes everything feel easier and better to read." I want you to reflect on that for a moment. I think we have all noticed when some things are easier or more appealing to read than others. Sometimes you look at something and it just looks daunting. Cho continues, "I came across a study by psychologist Kevin Larson. Larson has spent his career researching typefaces and recently conducted a landmark study at MIT about how font and layout affect our emotions. In the study, 20 volunteers, half men and half women, were separated into two groups. Each group was shown a separate version of the New Yorker, one where the image placement, font, and layout were designed well, and one where the layout was designed poorly. The researchers found that readers felt bad while reading the poorly designed layout. Sometimes this feeling would be expressed physically with a frown. The corrugator supercilii, how do you say that, medical people? Facial muscles that help produce a frown have been linked to the amygdala, an area of your brain responsible for emotion. Meanwhile, the participants who read content from the good reading layout felt like it took less time to read and felt better. People exposed to the well-designed layout were found to have higher cognitive focus, more efficient mental processes, and a stronger sense of clarity. The researchers concluded that well-designed reading environments don't necessarily help you understand what you're reading better, but they do make you feel good, causing you to feel inspired and more likely to take action. So what does that suggest to you about how your CV looks? If someone frowns while reading your CV or feels too overwhelmed to read it at all, what will the outcomes be? I know that's a little confusing though, because I just said that your CV shouldn't be too fancy, right? But there are still traditional CVs that are more visually appealing and easier to read. It doesn't have to be fancy to be visually appealing. Cho also says that your eyes need to pause periodically while reading in order to process the information. So if your CV is too crammed and you don't have enough space, it can be difficult for readers to process the information you are providing. Try to use white space in your formatting. Let's consider these samples, also provided by Cho's article. Which one do you think is easier to read and looks more appealing? Cho also says that spacing between letters helps readers move through sentences. Tight letters are harder to read. You can see these examples from Jessica Hishk. Which one is easier for you to read? According to Cho's article, there are 4 main categories of fonts to choose from. Serif fonts are the letters with short lines that come off the edges. They are viewed as more formal and traditional and are best suited for print. Sans serif fonts are letters without serifs. They are often viewed as informal and playful and are suited for digital formats. Script fonts look like handwriting and are used in formal invitations, things like that. It's not usually ideal for the body or the main content. And decorative fonts are informal, that are original and different, and look good for headlines, but not, again, for body copy. So a script and decorative font is probably not an appropriate choice for a CV, and they can even be very hard to read, which again takes a lot of extra energy. When choosing a font for body text, it's usually best to stick with serif or sans serif. Serif fonts are much easier to read on print, and sans serif can be good for online. According to Douglas Bonneville, a professional graphic designer, combining a sans serif with a serif font is the most popular principle for pairing fonts. It is suggested to use a sans serif font for your headers and a serif font for the body. It's easier for the reader's eye to follow when you use that pairing. It's also suggested to use bold and fonts that are heavier and lighter to create some visual distinctions. He also suggests using different sizes. For example, your header should be larger than the body content. And again, stick to just 2 fonts. For more details and tips on how to appropriately choose fonts, go to Mr. Bonneville's article. The link is shown here. Again, according to Cho, the most important thing when choosing a font is to make sure the letters are easily decipherable from one another, so your readers don't have to spend precious mental energy identifying letters. There's a trick that Hish uses to make sure your font choice is a good one. She recommends that you make your fonts pass the IL1 test. Basically, can you discern between an I, L, and 1 in your fonts? Notice how difficult it can be with some of these fonts compared to the others. If the font on your CV is too small, it will be difficult to read. It is standard to have about a 12-point font for the body content of your CV. Depending on the font you use, you could also do 10 or 11-point font, as that can be appropriate too. Anything lower than that is often going to cause a strain for your reader, and again, you want to make it as easy as possible to read your CV. Make your headers larger so it's easier to distinguish the sections. Also look for balance with your line length or how far your sentence spans across the page. According to Cho, if the line length is too short, your reader's rhythm will break because their eyes must travel back to the left of the page too often. A line length that is too long makes it hard to find where lines of text start and end. It can make it difficult for your reader to get to the next line without accidentally jumping to the wrong place. Research shows that your subconscious mind gets a boost of energy when jumping to a new line as long as it doesn't happen too often, but this energy dwindles as you read over the duration of the line. Another note, using bold, italics, and capitalizations to highlight important information is an appropriate choice. But keep in mind, emphasis should be reserved for the most important information and information that needs special attention. Dates, locations, etc. probably do not merit bold or all caps, as they are not the most important information for the reader to see. See the 2 samples? Which one is easier to read and pick out and distinguish the information? Let's talk about photos. Photos can look really cool on a resume or CV, I'll admit it. But I don't recommend a photo on a CV for a few reasons. Number 1, you may open yourself up for discrimination. Maybe you aren't attractive enough Or maybe you're too attractive. Maybe they don't like your ethnic background. Perhaps they think you look too old or too young, or you remind them of someone. Putting your photo on your CV just gives them the opportunity to decide that they don't like what they see. Number 2, it's not traditional for a CV. So again, some people might throw out your CV because you don't fit what they imagine as a professional representation of a CV. I even heard a story once where a physician threw away a CV because it had a photo on it. The bottom line, it's probably just not worth the risk, even though, yes, I agree, it can look really nice. Let's talk about contact information. Some people choose to leave their address off their CV or resume. They figure this is the digital age. Do they really even need it? But I recommend, unless you have a really good reason, include your address. It's better to be safe than sorry, and people will wonder why it isn't included. Sometimes it's required for background checks, or applicant tracking systems, or even just employer records. Also, be sure your email address is professional. Not obvious that you were 14 years old when you create it or that you have tacky judgment. And don't use your work email address either. So what if you're applying to positions in another state and you don't want employers to disregard your application if you aren't currently living there? One option is to include your current address and then a note about how you're looking to relocate to the blank area. Also, in professional documents and job applications, it is traditional to write out directions and streets. So instead of just N or ST, write out north or street. Another important consideration for your CV is the order. Arrange the content according to the needs of your audience. As a new graduate, for example, your education and credentials might carry more weight than your past employment history, so you might decide to put that toward the top. Or maybe if you've worked in geriatrics and you're applying for a position working with older people, that would also belong towards the top. Work from your most important and relevant experiences down to the least important and relevant. That way, if they don't make it all the way to the bottom, you aren't going to damage your potential. And just a few notes about common mistakes. Number 1, write out your degrees. It's more formal. And write out the full name and know you are not getting a master's of physician assistant studies or a master of science in physician assistant, nor did you get a bachelor's in biology. The formal name is Master of Physician Assistant Studies or Bachelor of Arts or Sciences, etc., in whatever your major was. It is also more formal to write out the full university name, and don't forget location, particularly city and state. By the way, Rocky Mountain University is not Rocky Mountain University of Healthy Professions or Rocky Mountain University for Health Professionals. The correct title of the university is Rocky Mountain University of Health Professions. Number 3, remember to include job titles, company, city and state, along with dates for any of the jobs you've had. Proofread, proofread, proofread. And have others proofread for you, because sometimes we are so close to a document we don't see it for what it really is, but what we think it is. Employers get so many applicants, sometimes dozens or even hundreds. They are looking for easy reasons to pare down the applicant pool, and even a small typo is considered an indication of your poor attention to detail or your lack of interest in the position. Some of the biggest typos on a CV aren't grammar or spelling mistakes, but rather issues with inconsistencies. For example, tenses should be past tense if you are no longer working there. Be consistent with tenses and be parallel. Don't use ing in one spot and ed in another. Periods do not belong at the end of a bullet point. And if you choose to use periods somewhere, use periods in matching ways in other spots on the CV. Be careful not to abbreviate January in one spot, but to write out June, or abbreviate UT for Utah and then write it all the way out somewhere else. Don't underline one header and then forget to underline another. And watch for extra spaces between sections or dates that aren't aligned like they are in other places. Basically, if you choose to use one style somewhere, be consistent and use that same style somewhere else. Your CV should have your full name and a page number on each page. This is best accomplished in a header and/or a footer. Some employers won't want your full version of your CV either and will prefer a 2-page version. If you aren't sure, you can send the 2-page document, and in your cover letter, let them know you have a more comprehensive version available upon request. There's some samples here that you can check out. Before you submit your CV to an employer, save it as a PDF. You've probably noticed how easily formatting can get messed up on your CV and how sometimes it doesn't look the same for other people as it did for you. After all that work formatting, the last thing you want is for your CV to not end up looking the way you made it, or making it look like you have errors. A PDF will help prevent these issues. Also, be thoughtful about how you save your CV. Consider putting your first and last name at minimum, and probably the position is a good idea to include as well. Another helpful tip is to save new versions of your CV instead of just changing the same document over and over. You might find out that recycling one version of your CV is helpful, especially if you're applying for similar positions over and over, so that you don't have to redo your CV every time. Your final assignment is to thoughtfully finish and polish your CV. Carefully consider the style and formatting, including font and white spaces. Save your fancy format for other purposes and don't use a photo. Ensure your contact information is complete and professional. Arrange the order of each section carefully to fit the needs of your audience. Double check that you don't have any typos, errors, or inconsistencies. And ensure that you have your name and page number on each page. I would also like you to print and bring 5 copies of your finished CV to class.